So tonight I thought I would talk about marine megafauna, and I'm going to arbitrarily decide that marine megafauna is about marine mammals and turtles, and Neil over here can disagree with me at the end of the lecture because he also works on marine megafauna, but he works on sharks. And actually, I think sharks are allowed to be marine megafauna. It's just I don't know much about them. And so that's why I decided to talk about marine mammals and turtles. So our region, and by our region, I'm going to mean the ASEAN region and the Australian region, and I'm going to cheat a little bit and think about the Pacific Islands that are very close to Australia. And our region supports an amazing array of marine mammals and turtles, and we have more than 40 species of whales and dolphins. We have 6 of the world's 7 species of sea turtles, and we have the animal that Ken was rude enough to say I was the only person that thought was beautiful, which is the dugong or the sea cow. And actually I'm going to prove Ken wrong in a minute, that there are a couple of other people that think about that. And the relationship between the ASEAN region and the Australian Pacific region varies with different species. So there are some species, like this absolutely cute little guy on the left here, that are restricted to Asia. So this is called Neophycena, or the finless porpoise, and actually it's restricted to coastal Asia. So I've just been in the Philippines and they don't have Neophycena. There are other species like this guy here, which is called the Indo-Pacific bottlenose dolphin, which is the coastal equivalent of the flipper kind of dolphin that occurs here, that occurs in this whole region from East Africa across to the Solomon Islands and Vanuatu in the tropics and subtropics. And actually there are a few other species that have that distribution, including the much maligned dugong. And then there are species like these very strange looking dolphins, and they're sibling species. So there's a different species in your region here called the Irrawaddy river dolphin, and in Australia, and one of my students discovered this, there's a genetically distinct look-alike kind of species which is called the snubfin dolphin, and there are some other species that have that relationship, but there are certainly many where we have species in common. In recent years, satellite tracking, some of these animals can be tracked by satellite, which I think is fantastic. And that is showing that quite surprising species have explicit links between Australia and the ASEAN region, particularly Indonesia. So this is the pygmy blue whale. So the blue whale is the largest animal that's ever lived. The pygmy blue whale is still pretty large, but not as big as its cousin. And animals have been satellite tagged down here off Perth in the Perth Canyon and tracked going up the Australian coast to about here and then swinging offshore and ending up in Indonesia. And they might actually go further than that, but no one has tracked them going further, and then they come back again. So they have this system whereby in the southern hemisphere summer, so like now, they're up here, and then in the winter they're down here, and actually down here. But they don't, so far we don't think they go right down to Antarctica like the blue whale. So you can see huge links, the same animal being tracked over these incredible distances. And the same is true with some species of turtles. So these are people in my research group at the university who've tagged 2 species of turtles in this area of Torres Strait between Australia and Papua New Guinea, and you'll hear a bit more about that later in this talk, and places off really remote areas in Australia, and some of them they not only track from Torres Strait across to a long way to other parts of Northern Australia, but some of them are going across again into Indonesian waters. In fact, turtles have amazing connections between the ASEAN region and Australia. So Australia has some really important nesting beaches, but for some species actually the really important nesting beaches are in South Australia, or in Southeast Asia, sorry. And there are different species here and they have different patterns, but if we take this one, this is the hawksbill, this is the one that you would see made for jewellery, and this is the turtle shell turtle. And again, these animals here up into Malaysia come back into Australia. Leatherbacks have the reverse issue. They have much more important nesting beaches in Southeast Asia and also Papua New Guinea, and just a few in Australia, and then they come back and spend feeding time in Australian waters. The green turtle, which is the one that people like to eat, the major nesting grounds are in Australia, but they're travelling across into Southeast Asia and also the Pacific. And this is the olive ridley, which is one of the ones that was satellite tracked. And again, you've got these really strong links between the 2 regions. But for travellers, the most amazing, I think, is the loggerhead turtle, which is the one with a big head that eats mollusks, like this guy, and hard shells. And there are 2 genetically distinct stocks in Australian waters, and the one in Western Australia goes up into Indonesia. Again, that's a very common pattern for many of these animals. And the one from Eastern Australia goes across almost as far as South America, so across the waters of many countries. But it isn't only links across space, there are also incredible links across time. So this is particularly for the animals that people like to eat, so green turtles and dugongs. So in Torres Strait, which is that area between Australia and Papua New Guinea, which is without question the dugong capital of the world, they have been harvesting these animals and harvesting them sustainably, which is even more remarkable, for turtles for 6,000 years and dugongs for at least 4,000 years. And probably it's the same as turtles, but that hasn't been proven by the archaeologists. So just imagine people had been harvesting these animals for thousands of years when the pyramids were built. Or some of the great thousands of years when Angkor Wat was built, some of the great temples of Asia. So it's a very, very long time. And this is not a modern phenomenon. So this is a midden with 10 or 11,000 dugongs, a single midden on a single island, and there are many of them. And these have all been dated for a few hundred years before European settlement. And the archaeologists have shown that the nature of the harvest in terms of the size distribution of the animals has not changed for thousands of years, which is, quite incredible, because these species are very long-lived and very slow breeding and actually very hard to harvest sustainably. But there's a lot of them in that particular place. There's not a lot of them in anywhere else that I know of. But there are, so that place the cultural values of these animals are incredible. So at James Cook University in Townsville in Cairns, when students graduate who come from Torres Strait, they wear special sashes, and the sashes have a dugong on one side and a turtle on the other. And when you go up there, and the children wear school uniforms and they have dugongs and turtles monogrammed on the pockets, and there are dugong signs on the buses and things like that. So they think they're pretty nice, Ken, and it's in the art. But it's not only there. So this is an amazing story that happened here less than 20 years ago. When I say it happened here, it happened across the causeway in Johor. So this animal, this dugong, was caught in a kilong by that guy. And he was a Chinese medicine man, and he said, right, I am going to look after this dugong. It's just a baby, as you can see, and he fed it Chinese medicine, and he charged people from the local village to come and look at this strange animal which everyone believed was extinct in Malaysia. Well, the authorities, the Malaysian authorities, said it's not legal for you to keep this animal. And World Wildlife Fund and the other conservation NGOs said it must be released. Well, it was a baby. It was going to die. It was going to die anyway. It needed milk, not Chinese medicine. But anyway, he said, if you make me release this animal, very bad things will happen. Anyway, they did. And of course, the animal washed up dead the next day. That was, I think, pretty predictable. But then what happened, in the Johor Strait, just here, 3 more dugongs washed up dead in the next 3 days. And the director of fisheries in Malaysia told me that it was the hardest thing he ever had to deal with. Anyway, they asked me to come over. I didn't know what I was supposed to do. And I arrived in Singapore, and I was met by Malaysian officials, and they said, under no circumstances are you to speak to the press. So I was very happy about that. I didn't want to speak to the press. And one of the Malaysian colleagues said, so, you know, we dug up exhumed dugong carcasses. Again, I honestly don't know what we were supposed to say. They were dead. Everyone knew that. They were dead and very smelly by that stage. And but this guy said, I believe that if there are dugongs in Malaysian waters that are coming into the Johor Strait, they will be in the islands off the east coast of Peninsular Malaysia. So the Malaysians said, right, so we got up in a helicopter and we went out to those little islands and we saw lots of dugongs. When I say lots, not like Torres Strait, but we saw, I don't know, a dozen or 20, something like that. At which point the Malaysian fisheries people were very happy because this was getting them off the hook. And they said, please, Professor Marsh, you now have to have a press conference. So I did. And then that was the stimulus for the dugong research program in Malaysia, which has mainly occurred in Sabah. But it was, and then if you go, and this is really almost impossible to believe, but it's true, that if you look up 50 years of headline news in Malaysia, and you look up 1999, this was one of the biggest issues in Malaysia that year, which is incredible, but I guess shows the controversy that can happen over animals like this. But it's not only in Malaysia. So in Trang, in Thailand, has anyone here been to Trang? You have. So, you know, they have dugongs there and they really value it. And so there are these incredible statues in Trang, which are very like kind of Victorian English statues, but instead of horses, there are dugongs. But it's not only dugongs. If you go to Lavina in North Bali, there are lots of statues, and they're dolphins, spinner dolphins. If you go to Kota Terengganu on northeast Peninsula Malaysian coast, there are turtles everywhere in the roundabouts. There are statues of leatherback turtles because it used to be a really important leatherback area. It's not now. So these animals not only are ecologically very interesting, but they also have incredible social values almost everywhere, although different species are important in different places. Now, I just want to give you Marine Megafauna 101, because I'm not going to go into this in great detail, but there are some things you need to know. All of these species are very long-lived and slow breeding. So, dugong, for example, lives more than 70 years. Many of the dolphins live more than 30 years. The turtles live even longer. And they tend, and because of this, and a dugong, for example, only has one calf at a time, and most of the marine mammals, that's true, and they nurse that calf for a long time, and that's a calf on the back of a mother. They don't always spend their time there, but they're very close to the mother. And they will nurse that calf for at least 18 months, and then they're pregnant for like 14 months. So you can see they don't have a calf very often. And there are variants on this life history pattern, but the take-home message is for all of these species, only relatively small human impacts are sustainable, unless you've got absolutely huge populations, which we still have in some parts of Australia, but there is nowhere in Southeast Asia now, and there may never have been, because the continental shelf is very, very different. And so although most of the species I'm talking about are present in the ASEAN region, they're not present in huge numbers. The other thing is that because these animals live, particularly in the ASEAN region, live in quite small populations that change very slowly, any impacts, populations going down or up, are very, very hard to detect. And it's very hard to know what short-term impacts, such as if you build a port and there's a lot of pile driving and the animals go away, and then come back, what that means. So they're quite difficult. But the most difficult thing is they move across jurisdictions. So different countries have different rules, and so countries make a decision to ban something or other, but then the animals move to another country where the same thing is legal. And that's a big problem, and there's an international convention, which I'll talk about later, for these sorts of species. So there are many other species that do this, but these sorts of species called the Convention of Migratory Species. So there's a lot of mismatches with all of these species. They're operating at ecological scales which are huge, they are operating at time frames which are very long, but the social systems that are put in place to manage human impacts on these species tend to operate at completely different scales. They're operating at the scale of a country, and the political cycle in every country is quite short relative to this. And so there's this mismatch between the way the animals operate and the way our society operates. And that is very challenging. And the other thing that's very challenging is that the hazards or the threats to these species are numerous, and many of them occur across countries. So, but some of them don't. Some of them are operating in a more local scale. So, for example, and it matters if these animals are killed by people. So there are some things that are quite local. Vessel strike, for example. These are animals that were killed near Brisbane by a ferry. That's a local impact. So, and boat strike is a problem in a number of places, but it's a local problem. Whereas some of the pollution, like plastic bag pollution, is operating at huge scales. Dynamite fishing is a very big problem in many countries in Asia. Illegal trade, particularly in turtle products, is a big problem. And of course, coastal development is a problem in many places. But the two that are operating pretty well everywhere is bycatch, particularly bycatch in nets, and of course our changing climate. So you can see that rules can be put in place in a country, but it's not going to have any effect on the changing climate, which is a global problem. For bycatch, you can do something at a local scale, but illegal fishing operates at international scales. So it's an extremely difficult issue to manage those human impacts, and that does matter. The other thing that is very difficult, and this is, I'm going to use the dugong as an example, is that the situation is really different in different countries. So if we look officially by the International Union of Conservation of Nature, they list the dugong as on their red list, but as vulnerable to extinction. In some parts of the range, such as Japan, now there's a rich country with a dugong problem because there are only a very low number of dugongs in the Okinawa area. And even now, there are huge fights between the Japanese and the American government over that. It's very interesting, actually. So these animals are almost certainly going to go extinct. It's a very small population. The favourite place of this small group of dugongs is where the Americans want to build a big base. Actually, the argument pretends to be about dugongs, but it's really that the local people don't want that base, and so they use dugong as the excuse. There have been 2 major court cases about this in the United States where dugong, it's called dugong, the cases are called Dugong versus, and they're the Secretary of Defence in the United States. So Donald Rumsfeld. So there's a case in American case legal system called Dugong versus Rumsfeld. Dugong wins. There's another one called Dugong versus Gates, not Bill Gates, the Gates that was the Secretary of Defence. Dugong won that too, but actually it hasn't made any difference at all. And as things hot up in North Korea, I'm very, very sure it won't make a difference. So Japan, even though it's a very rich country, has a problem. Whereas and Palau has a problem, parts of India have a problem up here. In East Africa, where it's very poor, it's a problem, but probably not as bad as those places in red. In coastal Southeast Asia, there's a pretty big problem. Maybe in Indonesia, it looks like, because it's such a huge area, less of a problem. And actually, in Australia, mostly, they're doing quite well, although within Australia, as I'll explain in a minute, actually it varies there too. So it's very hard when people look it up and say, and in the Philippines, they told me that even though they were listed as vulnerable at a global scale, in the Philippines they've listed them as critically endangered. So my map is wrong, I just discovered last weekend. And even, as I said, within a country, the threats also vary. So these are dugongs, they eat seagrass, and this is based on my work, and we've done many aerial surveys for many years, and we've built spatial models, and red means there's a lot of animals, and we've looked at all along the coast, and you can see why I say that Torres Strait between Australia and Papua New Guinea is the dugong capital of the world. But let's compare the situation in Torres Strait here and the situation, say, in Hervey Bay, near a place called Maryborough, north of Brisbane, or you could choose Brisbane actually, but there are more in Hervey Bay. The threats to the animals in the different places are just entirely different. So up here, there are no cyclones because it's too far north, no severe storms like in Singapore. The habitat's in very good shape. Everything is very good. The only pressure is hunting, and the hunting's been going on for 4,000 years, and the animals are hunted in very local areas. And down here, actually, there are floods and cyclones that damage the seagrass. There's netting, but there's no hunting. And so people who know about the situation here think that up there it's absolutely outrageous that people are allowed to hunt. And so the Minister for the Environment in Australia told me that he gets more letters about this than any other species conservation problem in Australia except koalas. And as you probably know, Australians love koalas. So you think of this as a very strange, arcane problem, but actually it concerns a lot of people. So there are all these people who are stridently writing to the Minister saying that those dreadful Indigenous people should not be allowed to hunt because it must be bad. And my work that's gone on for all this time, and there are many other indicators, is showing, hey, there's not a problem. And yet people don't believe that because they automatically believe that hunting is bad. And so when I go to countries like Malaysia or the Philippines, they can't believe that we allow hunting in places like Torres Strait because it's completely outlawed in their country, but they don't it's really hard to imagine that it's a totally different situation. And that's the same problem that we have within Australia as well. But in low-income countries, the problem is, of course, much more severe, because in low-income countries, it can be an issue of food security. So I took this photo in southern Papua New Guinea at a place called Daru, and you can see that people are living in poverty, and you can look at the fish in the market and the turtles in the market. And you know, a former Vice-Chancellor of James Cook University used to work in Daru when he was a young man. He's quite old now, he's in his 80s. And I said to him once, I was having dinner with him, and I said, Ken, when you were a young man and living in Daru as the head of education for Western Province in Papua New Guinea, did they sell dugong and turtle in the market? Because I looked at what's happening now. And he said, good heavens no, he said. Now this is a guy who's about my height. He said, when I was a young man and I went to the market in Daru, the only thing they sold was barramundi. What do people call barramundi here? Sea bass. And he said the barramundi were bigger than me. So in, I guess, 60 years, they've gone from selling barramundi bigger than me to that. And so it's a very, very, very different situation. And then, of course, the other problem is that in many of these countries that are very poor countries, like Cambodia, for example, there is a lot of corruption. So the two countries here with low corruption are Australia and Singapore. Singapore is actually has an even lower corruption index than Australia. But in those countries, it is so difficult to impose top-down rules because people will break them and they will bribe their way out of trouble. So you can't work like that, and they really appreciate that in the Philippines, actually. I think it's quite impressive. The other big problem, and this is a huge problem for turtles, is that climate change is going to have a very big impact. Now, climate change will have an impact in several different ways. And the first way is that turtles are quite strange animals. They have what's called temperature-dependent sex determination. So that means that the temperature at which the eggs are incubated in the nest determines the sex of the young. So when it's warm, when it's too warm, they all die. When it's a bit warm, they are female, and when it's cooler, it's male. And so we have, and this is already becoming evident, of what's called the feminisation of the sea turtle population. So that's the first problem. The second problem is with sea level rise, we're going to lose nesting sites and the egg mortality, because the salt water gets into the nests and kills the eggs. And then if you have severe tropical storms, you get a reduction in the hatching success and a destruction of the habitat. You get strandings and disease. And so in 2010, 2011, in eastern Australia, we had a massive Category 5 storm and massive floods, and there were many, many turtles washed up dead. There are a lot of dugongs as well. So there's a high vulnerability for turtles to climate change. So although in Torres Strait, which is the dugong capital of the world, there are hundreds of thousands of large green turtles, our research shows, we don't actually feel very optimistic about that because of the impacts of climate change. And I'll show you what's projected to happen. So in the northern Great Barrier Reef, up to a third of the sea turtle nesting areas are predicted to be inundated by sea level rise. And the one of greatest concern is this one here, called Raine Island, which is the nesting site for green turtles for our whole region. So it's the major nesting site, and that stock spreads out into Indonesia and into the Pacific, as well as into Australia. But it's a bit worse than that. So Raine Island is a very good example of why isolation and protection may not be enough. So Raine Island is really remote. It's 130 kilometres off Cape York, and there are very few people live in Cape York. To go to Raine Island, you need lots of permits. It's very, very difficult to go. And the story goes that a former Prime Minister of Australia, after he ceased to be Prime Minister, went to Raine Island with some of his rich mates and was not allowed to land because he did not have a permit. So that's how strict it is. For those who are Australians in the audience, it was Bob Hawke. Okay, so we have this place that is, and all of these turtles are spreading out into the Pacific, up into Indonesia and Papua, and in a big nesting night, that's what the beach at Raine Island looks like. It's Turtle City. They're everywhere. And actually, they've done a lot of damage to the island, not surprisingly, because these are big animals and they're digging it all up. So they've caused, and this is a natural thing, they've caused severe erosion at Raine Island, and there are now these low cliffs. And when I say low cliffs, the cliffs are probably as big as Ken, a couple of metres tall. And what happens is these turtles are fairly dumb, and they wander along, and then they fall off the cliff, and then they fall on their backs, and they can't get back up again, and then they cook. And in a big nesting season, and there are some nesting seasons that are big and some that are not so big, more turtles die because of that than are killed by Indigenous hunting in Torres Strait. So that's a pretty big problem. The second pretty big problem is that because of the wind. This is a coral cay. The sand has been redistributed on the island, and so there's not enough sand for the turtles to dig a nest and have an egg chamber that's not going to be flooded by seawater. And when it's flooded by seawater, the eggs die. And so, for example, in 2013, they were getting nearly 400,000 eggs being laid a night, but that was leading to less than 3,000 hatchlings because of that problem. And there are 2 green turtle stocks in Eastern Australia, and in Torres Strait they were mainly the northern stock, but a few of the southern stock, and that genetics has completely reversed because there is recruitment failure at Raine Island, the most important nesting habitat in the world. So, actually, what should be done about it? Just before I get to what to be done about it, it's a problem of sand redistribution at the moment, not sand production. The wind and the turtles, the turtles stir up the sand, the wind has blown it, and it's blown it to parts of the beach where the turtles don't nest. So, what to do? So this was very controversial. I mean, you might think it's very strange. How could this be controversial? But it was in Australia for a long time because people said this is a natural process, we mustn't interfere with it. No one says that anymore. And with private sector money, people in Australia are actually very good at moving sand on beaches. And so when in the non-nesting season, they are now moving the sand around the island so that there is enough for the animals to nest in their favourite places. And the experiments are showing that in the reef profile sectors, the nesting success is not perfect, but it's much better than the non-reef profile sectors. And the other thing that's happened is they've built swimming pool fences on the top of those cliffs to stop the turtles falling off. But some of them are still pretty dumb, and actually they have to have people coming and rescuing the turtles with an electric wheelbarrow. And this is a guy from BHP who donated them $5 million. And I was lucky enough to go there last year, and this fellow who runs a mine, and you could see that he was really feeling like, why am I here? I've been told I have to be here by my company. But once he was in charge of a wheelbarrow moving turtles, he was very happy and he thought he was doing something. So that's him moving the turtles. But that's a short-term fix, because in the long term, the geomorphologists at James Cook University have shown that most of the sand there is made by little animals called forams, and they are going to do very badly out of climate change. And they bleach, and they also suffer from ocean acidification. So what's happening now is definitely good and a short-term fix, but in the long term, the prognosis is not good. Now, the other problem is some species continue to use habitats accessible to people. So they don't go away. People often think, oh well, you know, we can use Johor Strait and any sensible dugong will go and live somewhere else. Wrong. And so if you look here, these are, I think it's just incredible, these are dugong feeding trails in Johor Strait. So they're digging up the seagrass in what is the busiest shipping lane in the world. I would have said that was a very stupid place for a dugong to be, but they're there. In Queensland, here this is Gladstone, this is a coal port. In here, those grey lines are all dugong feeding trails. Are the dugongs going away from Gladstone just because they turned it into a coal port? No. Are they sometimes being hit by big boats? Yes. So that is a very difficult problem, and that's true of some of the other species too. So in Australia, I don't know about here, but these species, because of the Convention of Migratory Species, are called matters of national environmental significance, and they trigger the environmental legislation for impact assessment. In fact, the green turtle triggers our environmental assessments more than any other animal, terrestrial or marine. And so as a result of this and the massive port development, people have spent a lot of money, possibly not very wisely. But so for the port of Darwin, 3 of those dolphin species that I talked about at the beginning occur in that port, and the Australian government said to INPEX, the gas people, yes, you can build a gas plant here, but you have to spend a lot of money monitoring what you're doing to the dolphins. And $7 million later, they actually found the answer was not much, but actually there was this huge amount of effort. I privately think they could have got the same answer quite reliably and much more cheaply, but don't tell them that. Well-managed megafauna are really significant tourist attractions. And I would argue that some people would disagree with me, that in Western countries it's usually very well managed. So these are 3 examples in Australia. If you ever want to do something that is absolutely fantastic, can I recommend that you go swimming with minke whales in the Northern Great Barrier Reef. So it's very controlled, and they had to make it legal because the minke whales came and found the divers. And so you have to lie here at the surface on snorkel, and the whales come so close to you, it is unbelievable. So you can just be lying there, and within a metre, this whale will dive under you. I haven't done too many things that I've found as thrilling as that. There are also obviously humpback whale tourism, and there's turtle tourism, those loggerhead turtles again, at some places. That's very, very tightly managed, and I don't think it's having much of an impact. However, in developing countries, that's not true. So this is Lavina in Bali, where I showed you that statue, and there are actually more boats than dolphins. So the spinner dolphins come in every day, allegedly to rest. They don't get any rest, near the beach, and these little boats, which are fishing boats, go out and chase the dolphins. And it's really pretty out of control. And fishermen, they're the same people. If there are a lot of people there, they go take them out, and if there aren't a lot of people there, they go fishing. So they don't actually change their boats very much. I had one student who looked at what this was worth, and in this community, I mean, people go to Bali for lots of reasons, but people only go to Lavina for one reason, and that's to see the dolphins. It's a very, very long way from the famous tourist spots in Bali, and it's actually worth a lot of money to the community. Only 3% of it goes to the boatmen, but 97% go to all the other beneficiaries in the community for accommodation, meals, transport and souvenirs. So the boatmen and the community rate it as really, really important. However, the visitors, who are largely international visitors, actually don't think much of it. So most of them are not very satisfied, and they're very, very critical, and they put on their Facebook pages, don't go there, we can't recommend it. So I had a student who worked on this. It was a collaborative project between me and some people that know about tourism, and it turned out they're very reluctant to recommend the tour. So the student, who's an Indonesian student, told the fishermen about this, and they said, yes, well, we know this is a problem. We could have a code of conduct, so we didn't chase the dolphins. But we're certainly not going to reduce the number of boats because we all need the income. And then the problem is that there was no governance structure to implement any of this. So nothing happened. However, in Indonesia, they are now having a big program of marine protected areas, and this area near Lavina has been declared a marine protected area with a view to providing a governance structure to protect the dolphins and have some rules about tourism. Will that work? I don't know, but it's I think we can be a bit optimistic that it'll be better. So the Lavina Marine Protected Area has a focus on the dolphins, but the issue here is it's all very well having rules, but these people are poor and they are very dependent on the income. So unless they have alternative livelihoods, they will be very unlikely to change. So I think one of the things that I've learned from all this is it's all very well studying species biology, it's all very well studying the habitats, but unless you really understand the human side of the problem, you won't make a difference. And I think that most biologists have made the mistake of leaving that out. And that's why I think cross-disciplinary research in the future is going to be much more important than it has been to date. So you need to know about the species, you need to know about their habitats, you need to know about the threats, and you need to understand the community. Now, there are moves to do that. And so I said to you there was this International Convention of Migratory Species that many countries have signed. Actually, Singapore hasn't, as a matter of interest, but some of the neighbouring countries have. And under these conventions, there are memoranda of understanding between countries to cooperate, and there's one for dugongs and there's one for turtles. So you might think this is all very arcane, but actually there has been a huge amount of international interest on this. And the dugong one, which has largely been underwritten by the government of the United Arab Emirates, they have a lot of dugongs there, has managed to get a lot of money, and I'm talking millions, many millions, from the Global Environment Facility to have a big project, which is probably the biggest project for international seagrass conservation that exists. So dugongs have been used as the flagship species for the habitat, which is seagrass. And there are a number of countries that are involved in this, including Malaysia. And in Malaysia, they're doing work in Peninsular Malaysia, close to here. And this is happening at 120 local sites. There are 26 partners, and it's being implemented by the United Nations Environment Programme with assistance from the Dugong MOU Secretariat and this Species Conservation Fund. So actually it's a very big project. As part of this project and funded by the energy company Total, we have been working on a conservation kit for people in developing countries. And the idea is that often people say, like in the Philippines, actually know they have a problem. They know they need to do some work to inform the solution of the problem, but actually they don't know what to do. And this is an online kit and that a bunch of us have worked on. And for example, I ran a workshop on that in Manila on Monday, I think, yes. And we've done workshops in various places. And it's really saying that you can't just work on the animals, you can't just work on the habitats, you have to work on the human dimensions of the problem. And so we've had social science to work on the human side. We've had people like me working on the dugong side and seagrass people. And it enables, so people from India, for example, said to me, if we'd had access to this, it could have saved us three months' work, because we were going back to the primary literature. We had no idea where to start. And this has been designed so that even in countries with very little internet connection, it's still accessible. It's not fancy at all. So that's one of the things that can be done. So, where do I think Singapore comes into all this? Well, I think the future of marine megafauna science, as opposed to studying the human dimensions of the problem or the habitat, so all of that's really important, but I think the future is very high tech. And people in Singapore are extremely good at high tech. So the things that are happening now is that aircraft, so I've done those aerial surveys for 30 years. I expect the aerial survey we will do next year will be the last time ever. I'm actually really happy about that, because I think that I have risked my life too many times flying in little planes at low heights in remote areas. So it will be all done by drones. And that technology is moving very, very fast. And in remote areas, you're not doing the sort of drone you can go buy in the shop. These are seriously big drones that are developed by Boeing. Similarly, one of the problems of using drones is you generate thousands and thousands and thousands of photographs, and people cannot look at them. So there have been neural network research to train computers to identify animals. So that is very high tech. Satellite telemetry. People have been satellite tracking marine mammals since the 70s, but the technology has become more and more advanced and smaller. And now there are electronic pills that animals can swallow that will feed back and tell amazing information. Now, most of this technology has actually been developed in the United States, but my expectation is that countries like Singapore are going to work in these areas. They'll probably work in these areas for other reasons, but there will be spin-offs. And lastly, which I think is a very sad story, but I think it's going to happen, in the ASEAN region, there are some truly amazing animals, particularly river dolphins, that are probably going to go extinct if they're not put into captivity. Now, people are very, very reluctant to do that. There has already been, the Yangtze River dolphin has gone extinct in China, and there are others like this one, the Ganges River dolphin. So again, if these species are going to be saved, it's going to require high-tech work in rich countries. You can't do that in a country that doesn't have advanced technology. So migratory marine megafauna, I think, offers quite a lot of opportunity for Australia-Singapore collaborations. There are a lot of challenges. There's the mismatch between the ecology, the jurisdiction and culture, and that's huge. But over here, there is high-income countries can offer leadership and technological assistance. And I think that let's take the Philippines. In the Philippines, they won't do the fundamental science that will be needed, that will be informed by the technology. They will be doing grassroots conservation using our dugong resource kit, right? But we will need to do some fundamental science. It will increasingly be high tech, require people with outstanding mathematical skills and computing skills, and that's where I think high income countries can be very useful. And of course Australia does have the advantage there of having some very significant populations. So please ask questions. Thank you.